Here, the Vice President, who will get things started.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. And this webinar is designed to give everybody an understanding and some insights into what the election results from last week mean, both at the federal and state level. And we have a great series of speakers and friends with us today, so we're really excited about the information that we're going to present. So let me just quickly tell you who the presenters are. Okay, so we have April D. Simone who will be joining us here in a few moments from Designing the We. April is in New York. Celinda Lake, unfortunately, wasn't able to join us, so she's represented today by David Merman, one of her colleagues at Lake Research Associates. Sam Munger from the State Innovation Exchange. They're based in Madison, Wisconsin, and have an office in Denver, Colorado. They focus on state public policy. And finally, Sean Chapman. Sean is Chief of Staff at Solar City. So each of those folks are going to speak for a while, and then at the end of the conversation, probably about 20 to the hour, we're going to open it up and take questions. Because there are so many people on this call, we decided that it's best that people write in their questions online, and then we will go through those and pull out. We'll try to combine those and ask the panelists to respond. Okay, so let me tell everybody a little bit about the American Sustainable Business Council first, for those of you who are not so familiar with it. We were formed in July of 2009. As a national business organization making the business case for a sustainable economy. And our central premise when we started ASBC was that for too long, conservative and traditional and institutional business interests were really running the show. And they were having an outsized impact on the public debate and also influencing how the media would write stories. So it was often the case that it was the environment versus job, or we couldn't have health care without going broke, or we couldn't have a sustainable economy and pay people well. So it was always this dichotomy that was presented. So ASBC has evolved over the past 7 years to take on very entrenched interests both at the federal and state level, including groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we work both at the national level here in Washington, D.C., and at the state level. And you can see on your screen, for those of you who are online, that we work on a wide range of policy issues. And when we talk about a sustainable economy, we're really concerned about what you might refer to as the triple bottom line of people, profit, planet, and believe that companies that are the most successful are those that take care of their workers, invest in their communities, have high quality products, and are good environmental stewards. And that is how we decide to pick our issues around those central themes. We here in Washington are quite concerned about what happened last week, on Tuesday, and have some, some concerns and some reservations about the direction of the federal government here in Washington, D.C. So what we'll be planning to do over the next weeks and months is continue to hold a series of webinars and strategy calls and invite you all to participate in those. Those calls and strategy sessions will focus on calibrating a policy and advocacy agenda, which is really what we focus on. And we do that by bringing our business members into the discussion, by bringing them here to Washington or working with them at the state capitol level, by developing op-ed, letters to the editors, bringing business people in to testify in front of legislative bodies, and essentially making the business case. So today we represent over 250,000 businesses, some publicly traded, some mid-sized, some small, micro-entrepreneurs, and really across every sector of the economy. And we've evolved to become the nation's largest business advocacy group working for a sustainable economy. let me stop there, and we'll get back a little bit more to what the council does. But my final thought before we move on is that we absolutely know that in the political environment we're living in, that the business voice is going to matter as much, if not more, than it ever has. And we have a slogan here: it's better to be at the table than on the menu. And as we watch President Trump begin to make some appointments, we have some serious concerns that those interests coming from the business community are not necessarily going to represent the sustainable, socially just, ethical, and environmentally sound economy that we think is needed in this country. So with that, let me move to my colleague April DeSimone. And April is based in New York, does work around the country. And we asked April to join us today because she's been focusing on a number of infrastructure, community development, and social justice issues. And as we know, there's lots of talk about investing in infrastructure, and what we are most interested in and what we're going to be advocating for is socially just, economically sustainable infrastructure development. So April is going to speak for a few minutes on that topic. So April, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard, for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. Just before I start sharing some of the work that Designing the We is doing, I really just want to emphasize that the divisive, racialized climate that we found ourselves in leading up to last Tuesday's outcome really emphasizes and is the inspiration behind the work of Designing the We. My colleague and co-founder Braden Crooks and I met in grad school, and we couldn't be more opposite in our world. A young man from Virginia, an older woman of color from the Bronx. And in spending 2 years in grad school together, we realized, although unlikely collaborators, we shared a passion about seeing a very different human experience in our society. And at the root of really creating or designing that built environment, we realized that there is a massive education that needs to take place because people are so disconnected to the on-the-ground realities. As part of our journey in creating more understanding and empathy, we launched an exhibition called Undesign the Red Line. And as you can see in the picture here on the webinar in the background, it became a tool that we use to really contextualize content, policies, investments, starting from the beginning of our country and what has led up to where we're at now. And it really created a space for people to contextualize and understand and foster an intentionality of why it becomes so important to produce outcomes that really speak to just and inclusive, not only economies, but ecosystems. So part of what we've been doing is the We Lab, as you can see here, is creating very intentional spaces that houses the exhibit and begins talking about policies like racial zoning, restrictive covenants, and redlining that all were part of federal government or federal state policies that really created the landscape and terrain that we're dealing with today, and that again has perpetuated such a disconnect. And in these spaces, we're building the conversation around infrastructure with things around affordable, quote-unquote, affordable housing, shared economies, wealth building, so that when people are asked to come to the table to understand how they can contribute or add their value into the equation of changing our environment and grounding transformative change, it's not just based on a siloed approach of what we're dealing with today, but it's grounded in an extensive unpacking of what happened and what continues to happen and is very much shaped by the policies in this country. For example, with housing, often it's the language around creating affordable units rather than understanding that how do we create opportunity neighborhoods to desegregate our communities, because it's a long history, again, of policies like redlining that color-coded communities and determined where people could live based on the color of skin. And we feel, and in our travels, that as people are exposed to this information and in these lab spaces, we begin to really build empathy for one another and understanding. I can't tell you how many times people have walked away saying we never knew this existed. We didn't understand that the impact of the macro systems on our everyday realities. And that's when we can begin to really shape, again, the human experience on the ground. And we've channeled this process, this process, in several projects, including one here in the Bronx that started off with working with youth 14 to 21 to really understand their neighborhood and do some mapping, asset mapping, and identify opportunities. And what manifested out of that, the organization that they were a part of owns a lot or a building. And instead of just focusing on building affordable housing, the youth really came up with very innovative ideas on how to heal communities, how to create intergenerational spaces, and how to invite others who have never been into their community to build, again, a more just and vibrant human experience. And the students focused on things like a maker space, a music center, a kitchen incubator that would drive at the base of it not just the activities itself, but the understanding of why these activities became important. And now what started off as just a classroom of participatory design has really evolved into manifesting this project in real time. And we are in the process now of working with several stakeholders, architects, ourselves as urban planners and architects, and the community to really bring an investment portfolio together to now begin vetting this model to the community. And again, it's intentionally based and responds back to a lot of the macro issues of wealth divide, of racial divides in our community. Another quick example is in Trenton, New Jersey, we were brought in to facilitate a community engagement process after an urban farm sprung up in East Trenton in a historically disenfranchised community. There was very little engagement by the wider community in the design process or in the creation of this space. And when we went out and we used the Undesign the Red Line exhibit, it really created an opportunity for community members to voice their opinions, to be included at the table, and to, again, define their value exchange to this whole process. And what started off as a couple of rows of produce, maybe a solar panel, and a kid's butterfly garden, has now matured into 5 micro-enterprises, cooperatively structured by people in the community that include everything from a farm to truck table to drive into the center of town to tap into the economy of the state employees that usually don't venture out of a certain radius, to a multi-purpose space on the farm itself that houses a vast array of activities that again respond back to the needs of the community. I'm not sure how to move these slides along, so forgive me because it's my first time on this type of April,
we'll move those along for you, and just keep an eye on the clock here. We're a little behind, so if you could.
Sure. No, and so that really, I mean, that concludes sort of the intentionality behind building an infrastructure and partnering with strategic stakeholders, again, before just to create outputs, to delve into a better understanding of what social justice, inclusive economies, and a vibrant human experience means in our society. Again, thank you everyone for listening, and I do hope to connect with many of you on future endeavors.
The long-term trend we've been monitoring in the electorate is that it is becoming more diverse, and the country is becoming more diverse, of course. The electorate is moving more slowly than the country as a whole. A lot of people, communities of color vote at lower rates. They're not participating in quite as high numbers as white voters. But if you see if we go one more slide, there we go, we see the sort of general trend over the past 16 years of the white electorate is getting smaller. Projected turnout by Pew Research, which is one of the better national pollsters, but it appears that this was not quite, didn't get quite the strength of turnout that we were hoping for among African American and Latino voters, so there will be a little bit less than this, but this trend is nevertheless real. However, one thing that changed in the electorate this time is that the white voters did move a little bit more Republican than they had in previous elections. So on the next slide you see, and there are really three big cleavages, and this is all from the exit polling, which has its own issues in terms of accuracy, but it is the best measure that we have, best resource we have for understanding sort of big picture differences in the electorate. So three key cleavages in the voters this year by gender. Women voted by 12 points for Hillary Clinton, men voted by 12 points for Donald Trump. That gender gap was apparent in all the polling leading up to the election, and it was quite wide at the end. But we did see some movement of white women back toward Trump late in the election, and therefore Clinton did not benefit quite as much from this gender gap as we had hoped. We also saw some white men moving, who were already fairly Republican, moving even a little bit more strongly Republican this year as well. On the next slide, you see the breakdown by age. There has been growing, and this was particularly strong in both of the Obama elections, but it continues strong in this election. Young voters being much more Democratic and progressive in their outlook. We did see a pretty wide victory for Clinton among the millennials, 18 to 29-year-olds, and also winning the 44-year-old voters by 8 points. But Trump winning the older voters, baby boomers and above, including seniors by 8 points, and this pre-retirement age by 9 points, 45 to 64, and that's a group that had not been had been doing a little better for Democrats previously. So that's a concern, obviously, going forward in terms of because that's still a big cohort of voters. But as you see, the younger voters as they move in are becoming more progressive. And then on the next slide, you see by race, and again, we had a very racially polarized electorate with white voters going for Trump by a margin of 21 points. African American Latino voters, and this is out of the exit polls, there's a bigger and I think better poll of Latino voters run by Latino Decisions that has a bigger margin among Latino voters. I think that this margin is probably not quite this close among Latinos, but nevertheless, Democrats won Latinos substantially. They won Asian American voters substantially, which is a growing group, and they won African American voters overwhelmingly, but they did lose white voters by 21 points, and in the end, the distribution of those votes in certain states led to the narrow defeat. The other key cleavage particularly among white voters on the next slide is, and a lot has been said about this, is education. So we break down by gender and education here, and we see that the base of the Trump coalition is white non-college men. He won 72% of those, and strikingly, and of some concern, white non-college women. And this is a group that Clinton expected and wanted to do better with. It's a group that we've been concerned about the sort of whether we had an economic message that was connecting with these voters, and in the end they broke for Trump, and he won those white non-college women 62-34. That obviously is a real challenge, and if we're talking about economic justice, that's a group we need to be talking to and having a little bit more success with. College-educated white men also voted for Trump, and that has been traditionally a Republican constituency. It did get a little closer actually this time, and then white college-educated women were the one group of white voters who did in fact vote for Clinton by 6 points, 51 to 45, and there was a swing toward Clinton among that group. So let me just touch, so that's sort of what we have right now in terms of the vote. There's again a lot more analysis to do in terms of how to connect and reach out to these voters, which we're happy to discuss with folks at any time. We certainly have a lot of thoughts about how to move forward. But let me touch on a few things we have also measured in terms of issues. So moving forward, the next few slides here, oops, get right up to it in just a second. Just a few issues that we know are of importance to sustainable businesses. And you see, first of all, this is the issues that the voters were most concerned about. Just, we need to meet voters where they are if we want to have effective communication and political messaging. So it's worth noting that those who voted for Trump in this election So the top issue for everyone was the economy and jobs, and that was true for both Trump and Clinton voters. But if you break down the Trump and Clinton voters, you see that the top issues for Trump voters included the economy, jobs, healthcare, but also terrorism and dysfunction in government. Interestingly, immigration, which got a lot of attention, was actually the 5th most important issue to Trump voters. It was not top of their list. Clinton voters, same two at the top, economy and healthcare, both very important to Clinton voters as well, but the two that are distinct for Clinton voters that were not true for Trump voters are education, and as one of the very top issues for Clinton voters, and the environment and climate change. And of course, we have seen, unfortunately, climate change become a very partisan issue, an issue where we're not connecting well with Republican voters, and you know, it obviously is hampering the ability to have a kind of national consensus on policy there. So those divides are pretty apparent in terms of issues. On the next slide, you see one of the issues that we've talked with a lot of your members about, and we actually have, oops, our numbers didn't pop up there for some reason, but you see the question was, how important is government action to lower prescription drug prices? And 63% said it was a top priority. So this drug prices is a really critical issue, one that neither party has, to the voters' minds, has addressed effectively, and one that as we look to, okay, what's next for health care, if the message of the Republicans was repeal and replace Obamacare, the question is with what, and will it address drug prices? And then on the next slide, the question of will there be an option, an insurance option, such as a public option, this we were hoping would be the next advance in Obamacare, if in fact we had some, you know, potentially Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. But, you know, for now in the situation of repeal and replace with what, the idea that there would be a public health insurance option, 70%, so that's a positive idea. Even if you say government administered, it's still 53%, a majority. There are Trump voters in those blue bars, people who voted for Trump who want to change, but nevertheless actually want some kind of public health insurance option. So that's something to be in the mix when we talk about how healthcare is going to be changed going forward. And then one thing that voters did at the progressive end in this election is when they actually had issues on the ballot, they voted very progressively on a number of issues, including campaign finance, including cracking down on different kinds of you know, changes in elections in their state. And on the next slide, we see that they voted very strongly for minimum wage to increase it. Notably, and we polled for 3 of these 4 campaigns, and you'll note that the number there was set at $12 per hour, and most of them that turned out to be a sweet spot in terms of voter support and being ready to move and increase the minimum wage that amount. But solid majorities, including in some states here, such as Arizona, that Trump won, nevertheless, solid majorities voting to increase the minimum wage by $12 per hour. So if the moves of the Republican Congress are to, you know, reduce overtime pay, eliminate overtime pay, or reduce the minimum wage, or pursue that kind of agenda, they are flying in the face of what voters did and were looking for in this election. And then just to note on climate change, we saw the partisan divide in terms of how important a priority voters think it is. But voters do think that action needs to be taken on climate change, and we do see, this is in a survey we did last year for Eco America, you see not only do they think the federal government has an important job to do, that they should be taking action on climate change. 82% say that the federal government should be taking a great deal or some action on climate change. But state and local government, 82%, and American businesses, 86% of the voters think that businesses should be taking a great deal or some action, notably a majority thinking that businesses should be taking a great deal of action. So there's a great deal of support for the idea that this is a concern, it's something that government and business need to address, but obviously some partisan divides about how to do that. Notable, however, that business clearly has a big role to play here. So there's a whole array of issues, obviously, we're going to be confronting, and it's going to be difficult to move a progressive agenda with the way Congress is going to be constituted, but finding public support, building that public support, and connecting with voters on these issues is going to be an important part of that. So stop there and acknowledge Celinda and the rest of my colleagues who pulled these numbers together.
Great. David, thank you so much. That was really insightful. let me just add a few things to David's remarks, a little bit of sort of advance notice of what the American Sustainable Business Council is doing and will be doing, reflective of some of this data. So first, we're in the process of talking to a number of Democrats on the Hill. Congress reconvened today, so lots of discussion in both parties right now. The leadership of both parties is going to be voted on in the next week or two. So we're going to know very soon who the speaker is. There's going to be a vote on whether Paul Ryan stays in and Ms. Pelosi for the Democrats, and also who's chairing what committees, which is really critical. So as we learn about who's in charge, we're going to be passing that on to you all. And then we'll be developing more specific strategies of how to get our members and other important business voices, which, as David noted, is really going to be critical, how we can get our voice into that process. So the other thing is, because we spent some time over the summer working with a number of Republicans, particularly at the Republican National Convention, we now have friends on both sides of the aisle, and we're going to be working actively with moderate Republicans who are also concerned about some of the issues we are, particularly around climate change and around environmental quality, around health care. And so it's important for us to be building those alliances. So let's shift to Sam Munger, and Sam is with the State Innovation Exchange, which you can sort of think of as the progressive equivalent to the American Legislative Exchange Council. And the State Innovation Exchange network is about 2-3 years old, works with hundreds and hundreds of state legislators across the country. The American Sustainable Business Council is collaborating with SIC on a number of issues. And the way we most effectively do that is bring our business colleagues into the process at the state level in state capitals. So Sam, let me turn it over to you, and thanks for being with us today.
Hey, thanks so much, Richard, and thanks to ASBC for having us on, and in general for being really good partners over the last. We've actually, we're less than 2 years old. We'll have our 2-year anniversary at our conference this December. So we're a pretty new project, but we are stepping into the shoes of some previous efforts in this area, like Progressive States Network and Center for Policy Alternatives, for those of you who go back that far. And as Richard said, a very quick way to understand what we're doing is as something of an analog or an antidote, perhaps, to what ALEC has done for conservative legislators. Although I think, both in our structure, in our values, and in the way we operate, we're quite different from ALEC in ways that I'm happy to go into on in the Q&A if folks are interested, or offline. But at the moment, let's focus on picking up a little bit where David left off. And I missed the very beginning of David's presentation, so hopefully I'm not recovering too much ground. But we're going to talk a little bit about the results of the election at the state level. And thank you very much. So just to provide a little bit of historical context, and also to make sure you're fully depressed by the time we discuss this year's election, I'm just going to take you back for a quick review of how we got here in some sense. So 1974, this is a map just after the elections of 1974, the height of the Watergate scandal, or rather the aftermath, the denouement of the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon had resigned. There'd been a huge wave election at both the federal and state level. The so-called Watergate babies class had just been elected to federal Congress. At the state level, Democrats had full control of state legislatures in 37 states, and Republicans in only 5. And it was both the high watermark for progressive control at the state level. It also was when, right around the time that Lewis Powell wrote this famous memo, the Powell memo, which led to the founding of ALEC, also the Heritage Foundation of the Cato Institute a few years later, of Citizens for a Sound Economy, which would later be rebranded as Americans for Prosperity. So it was at this time the conservatives really began investing heavily in state-level infrastructure, which frankly, and I'll try not to divert too much, but didn't pay dividends for them for many, many years. ALEC had virtually no one at their meetings for 10 years until Ronald Reagan adopted them, or for the better part of 10 years. And really didn't take hold until sort of didn't reach its full potential until 2010. So maybe this is an optimistic note as well. Things can change no matter how far the pendulum goes in one direction. It tends to swing back, and patient investment and patient capital at the state level does pay dividends. It sometimes takes a little while for it to do so, and the Chamber of Commerce and some other large conservative donors, the Koch brothers, really took that lesson to heart and actualized it. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll move through the next ones more quickly. This is 94. This was the famous Newt Gingrich contract with or on America, depending on how you style it. You can see that after this, even though it was a rather significant wave election for conservatives, state control was relatively split evenly across the country. This is, 20 years on, 20 years of conservative investment, and as I said, a fairly significant wave election. The next slide is the state partisan control, and I recognize we are State Innovation Exchange is a C3. A lot of folks on this call are, nonpartisan on some level. This is merely a proxy for, to look at historical election results and to look at trends in ideology. So, it simply happens that party control is a thing we can measure, whereas progressivity versus conservatism is much more difficult. So treat this as it is, as a proxy for sort of changing ideological and electoral patterns rather than some sort of partisan sign-off. Anyway, you can see before the 2016 election, before this past November, this past Tuesday, we were at what I think a lot of us thought would be more or less rock bottom, would be at a low ebb for progressive control. There were two really challenging off-cycle elections in 2010 and 2014, which led to the split that you see here, led to conservative control in a lot of states, 30 states controlled by Republicans, only 11 by Democrats. And I will say, if we thought we had hit rock bottom, perhaps we are now looking up at that, but not tremendously. If we flip to the next slide, you'll see that the results of this election were something of a mixed bag at the state level. I mean, on aggregate, I would say, on aggregate, Republicans picked up a few more seats. Republicans control one more state. Democrats control fewer. We could quibble about, what exactly, what this control really is in New York, which is complicated, in some of these other states too. They're still counting ballots, but I think in ways that are unlikely to change the election results. All in all, I would say it was more of a mixed bag. Now, for a presidential year, with a presidential electorate and a map that was reasonably favorable to progressives, these results are exceedingly disappointing. But they don't represent, and I think David talked about this too, this is not a sort of wave mandate election of the sort that media headlines might lead you to believe. It is a mixed bag at the state level. As you'll see in one of the subsequent slides, Republicans picked up something like 30 seats aggregate out of over 7,000, which is less than 1%. Here, it's at the bottom of this slide. It's really on the margins in terms of aggregate, change. And I think it's a mistake to read this as some sort of massive rejection of progressive values, a massive rejection of progressive candidates. It was, as I said, somewhat disappointing, and I think plenty of postmortems have been written and postmorta have been written and will be written further. But I think at this point, there were a lot of variables that went into this, but wholesale rejection of the values that that President Obama embodied and that I think most of us, all of us, subscribe to in at least some large part, is not part of the mix really. So you can see in aggregate, three chambers switched over to from Democratic to Republican control at the state level. That's the Kentucky House, the Iowa Senate, and the Minnesota Senate. The Kentucky House now means that there are no democratically controlled chambers in the entirety of the Old South. That is a pretty significant milestone, but it's the playing out of the the Southern strategy and trends that we see elsewhere. Iowa was pretty much a landslide, and Minnesota was a surprise. That was this place where progressives had hoped to pick up seats and maybe a chamber. Mark Dayton, of course, is still governor there, which is something of a backstop. On the other hand, there were Democratic gains in Nevada, which was a bright spot in general. Democrats picked up both chambers there, also the New Mexico House, and we picked up seats in the Washington Senate, but ultimately in ways that are not going to let us, not going to lead to progressive gains at the state legislative level. And then you can see down at the bottom, there's these like very on the margins, less than 1% changes, but all in all, Republicans did pick up seats and Democrats did lose them. Next slide recaps, I think, is going to if I'm remembering correctly, rehashes. Oh no, sorry. This talks a little bit about the map, the results at the gubernatorial and at other levels. This chart on the right is somewhat difficult to read probably for you, but I commend you to go to NCSL where it's up in its entirety, and you can see the exact changes in every state. But you can see that what happened in part is that Republicans picked up one more quote-unquote trifecta, which means that they control both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion, which means effectively, there's not a good check on moving conservative policies, and/or they're able to do that. Democrats, pending the results in North Carolina, went from 6 down to 5. And I think if you look at the states where Republicans picked up new trifectas, like New Hampshire, like Missouri, those are places where you can expect to see a wave of conservative legislation. On the contrary, places like Nevada, places like now New Mexico, these are places where there will be opportunities to move progressive policies. Now, admittedly, there are Republican governors, but I think, again, in ways I'm happy to go into in Q&A, there are policies that I think a governor like Brian Sandoval in Nevada might sign, and in addition, if he doesn't sign them, they will put him in a difficult electoral position, and for someone who's seeking higher office, presumably, or wants to go on in career, it will put him in a bit of a bind. So those are policies like paid sick days, like equal pay, like I think some things on the environment in terms of clean air and water. I think you will see, those are things that, in general, large pluralities across ideology support. And again, you saw David walk through some of those on healthcare as well. So on the next slide, you will see, I think, recaps a few of the ballot initiative results. Again, David touched on those, so I won't go into them too much. But suffice it to say that voters, in terms of the ballot initiative results as well, this was not a wholesale rejection of progressive ideology. Au contraire, minimum wage won, everywhere was on the ballot. Paid sick days won, everywhere was on the ballot. Legalized marijuana on some of the social issues, gun control largely won, more of a mixed bag on some of these other things like right to work and on schools. But in general, these were results at a statewide level, so same electorate theoretically as states that went red at the presidential level also were passing gun control measures and legal marijuana and minimum wage. And I think this shows in ways that, again, some have been written, some in some of the post-mortem, but that, the coalition that elected Trump elected him partly because they saw him as an avatar of a more populist economic platform that might include things like higher wages. It might include things like time off to spend with your family or a loved one when they are ill. And those are places where I think there will be continued opportunities at the state level, if not at the federal level. And in the last slide here, you can see just a quick gaming out. Now, this does not fully, by any means, incorporate the results of this last election. That's obviously something that's going to take a bit more analysis on our part, but these are a preliminary sense of where there might be opportunities in the next session. This is based both on the electoral and political map. It's based a little bit on upcoming elections in 2017 and 2018 that we're looking forward towards in a policy sense. We want to create have a policy landscape that informs and is informed by those elections without us actually planning to play in them directly. And it also includes things like the strength of existing state infrastructure on the ground, legislative leadership, legislative opportunities, and things like that. So that's a quick sense of where there might be opportunities, and I'm happy to walk through those a little bit more. And obviously, in any of those states, we could quibble about exactly how ripe and sort of promising the opportunities are, but I think there at least there's something to work with there. So let me wrap there and turn it over to the next speaker. And thanks again for having me. Happy to stick around to take some questions towards the end.
Good, Sam. Thank you so much. That was really insightful, and I think it's important to acknowledge the difference between, some of the statistics and demographic data at the federal level for the presidential campaign, and then some of the progress that was made at the state level. I just want to spend one moment. Someone had written in earlier asking, how does this all connect to the notion of a sustainable economy or a sustainable business agenda? So, I want to try to put a fine point on that and indicate that, the Trump agenda is still very much evolving. I think we could all agree to that. We're not seeing a lot of consistency yet. So as far as how this all affects the sustainable business community, our sense is that there will be some serious retrenchment on environmental policies, particularly climate, and a move towards carbon, a low carbon economy, which Sean Chapman's going to talk about here. On healthcare, it looks like the progress that had been made under Obamacare is about to be torn apart, but maybe the Trump administration will make greater strides in controlling costs, which will certainly be helpful for business. And then on all these workplace issues, we don't expect to see much progress on minimum wage, but the opportunity for progress on family leave and paid sick, it's possible. What we've been finding on Capitol Hill is that legislators understand the economic benefits of offering those policies. I'm not terrifically optimistic that a Republican-led Congress will get those pieces of legislation through, but we'll see. And long story short, we think that much of the forthcoming Republican-led Congress and the Trump administration-led administrative effort on policy is really threatening of the sustainable business values that we have. So we can return to that in a few moments, but next speaker to talk to us particularly about clean energy and is Sean Chapman with Solar City. And Solar City, as you all may know, is the nation's largest installer of photovoltaics. Sean, I'll turn it over to you to educate us a little bit about what the election means for the clean energy industry.
Excellent, Richard. So the next slide, we'll just get right into it. The good news is that solar is extremely popular. Every single polling firm I've ever worked with is sort of flabbergasted and insist that there must be an error because it polls stronger than, and quite literally, than mom or apple pie. If you look up YouGov, it does show stronger than those, and kittens. So the voter strongly support rooftop solar because it is the first time that they can actually make their own informed choices about electricity and cut the cord, as you will. It's bipartisan, and we certainly have federal setbacks for clean energy. There can be no question about that. However, on a state-by-state basis, and as some of the other speakers before me alluded to, there's great reasons for optimism. And the other point is energy has always been a state-by-state game on the politics, and I'll get into some of those. We can go to the next slide. So we're unclear about the executive branch. We're going to pay close attention to the appointments, federal agency personnel, and there are already some big concerns on choices on EPA and Interior. CPP is most likely in jeopardy. The flip side of that coin is CPP was not moving along anyway. As his last act, Justice Scalia made sure of that. So that is something that we weren't hinged to critically. I thought it was a good step forward, but we weren't hinged to it. There were important Senate races in New York, Colorado, Florida, California, New Hampshire, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And we're taking a look at that, and we'll certainly want to ensure that the federal ITC stays intact. Go to the next slide. On the state side, the legislatures and public utility commissions across the country are kind of making the decisions on solar. 44 utilities, this is just Q3 alone, 44 utilities in 25 states put in a request to increase monthly fixed charges on all residential customers by at least 10%. And 22 states considered altering or ending net metering policy. We have been under attack on this front for years, and we expect that to continue. So we're going to continue to push our agenda forward. Go to the next slide. Solar also was on the ballot in Florida and Arizona and in Nevada, and voters overwhelmingly decided to support solar. Amendment 1 was a ballot initiative put on entirely funded, $26 million in fact, by the utility industry. And it was admitted by their own operative that they intentionally misled voters to believe they were supporting solar, when in fact the measure, which would have amended the Constitution, would have the opposite effect. And early voting came out, it was very clear that voters were confused by this measure. In the end, however, when that information got out, which was expertly revealed and some very good reporting by the Miami Herald, folks were furious. And the measure failed to pass. It needed 60%, and it was pretty much 50-50, about 50.6% yes and 49.4% no. So that was a tremendous victory. In the Arizona Corporation Commission election, the slate of candidates that were backed by Arizona Public Service were in that state were backed as the pro-solar candidates. We have some questions, and we'll need to see how they adjudicate, and they are certainly going to be fair arbiters of energy. But the simple fact is that you cannot run in this country for any elected office anymore without addressing solar. You may have less than favorable views on solar, but you can't ignore it. And question 3 in Nevada passed overwhelmingly 70% in favor for energy choice initiative in that state. That will most likely be taken up by some measure by the legislature, and then it will be put back on the ballot. In Nevada, you need to pass in consecutive election cycles. But with such a mandate, it is very likely that the legislature will attempt to enact portions of it now because people have clearly spoken. Next slide, please. Went into this. We can skip. I kind of jumped forward a little bit to save us some time here. Skip here. Skip the next one. We can go to the next slide. Next slide. So we expect these fights to continue in the states, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, we have a changing representative, but people would continue to demonstrate a clear preference for solar and energy choice initiatives, like what we saw in Nevada. Next slide, please. So these are kind of our key takeaways at present. There's not going to be a federal framework for fighting climate change, and that's just the plain fact. So we're going to have to re-engage and retake up the mantle at the state level to determine the future of energy. In Florida, we learned a very, very strong and clear message that broad coalitions are the way to talk about energy and to engage with voters on energy. When it's just solar or just Solar City or Tesla or any entity, that is a corporation versus another corporation, and people they don't care or are turned off by that. But when it's very clearly about the voters' right to choose the electricity that supplies their homes, their families, their businesses, overwhelmingly we are successful. So we need a strong and coordinated business voice before legislatures and state public utility commissions in order to achieve those shared goals, or else we're pretty doomed. And I think I am hopeful that Florida showed the way for all this to work together.
Good, Sean. Thank you for educating us on what's happening across the country with renewable energy, and there are other issues that you didn't get to, such as what will happen with renewable tax credits, with federal support for hybrid vehicles, for electric vehicles. So there's an awful lot at stake here. Since we have some questions that have been suggested here, I'm going to just read off one. Somebody is asking if there is a network of allies working in the clean energy space, particularly what are businesses doing to procure low carbon sources of energy and increase efficiency, and then what businesses are speaking out regarding policies at the state and federal level. So in answer to that question, the American Sustainable Business Council is actively working on that. We've been pushing for the past 2 years and will continue to do so, putting a price on carbon. Companies like Solar City and Escola Electric, Cliff Bar, Patagonia, other members of ASBC have also been working actively on advocating for putting the price on carbon. So this is now a really critical time for companies to step up and engage on these issues. And I'm just looking here for a moment at an email about some of the people that President-elect Trump is considering to run the Interior Department and the EPA, and these are not big fans of a sustainable economy or clean energy, unfortunately. In answer to the question, several people have asked, how can you get these slides? So we will provide you with a link, and those slides, all these slides will be available for you to look at. Sam, someone had asked about, can you explain Nebraska's gray designation in the 2016 pre-election control slide? So can you, Sam, tell us anything more about Nebraska?
Can I? Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Nebraska should have been gray on all of those slides, and that is because Nebraska, unique in the 50 states, has a unicameral, non-partisan legislatures. So partisan composition maps are not meaningful in the same way for Nebraska. That is a holdover from the sort of earlier, the very early part of the 20th century progressive era. There were a number of states that once upon a time had nonpartisan legislatures as a result of the actions of the Nonpartisan League, which was a socialist affiliated group that promoted that kind of progressive reform. I'm something of a student of the state history, as you can see, but at any rate, effectively, I mean, folks know who the partisan designations are, and there is a Republican majority of sorts, but it does mean that, for instance, folks in the minority party, in this case the Democrats, end up being committee chairmen because the chairmanships and seniority is not allocated in the same way as it would be in a partisan legislature. So it's an interesting figment, and it has in some ways made Nebraska a bit of an outlier, like they did, as you recall, repeal the death penalty legislatively. Now that just got undone at the ballot, but they also have passed a number of sort of somewhat more progressive, other somewhat more progressive policies in recent years, including equal pay and some other things. Sorry, last session, this actually is not just recent years. And that, I think, can be at least in part attributed to the fact that they are set up in that nonpartisan way. So that is why it's gray on our map.
Got it, thank you. April, a question or two for you concerning the community economic development approach and how that collaborative method that you've been talking about, how could that be sold, so to speak, to the Trump administration? What value might they see in the approach you've been supporting?
Well,
I'm sorry. That was for April DeSimone. Is she still there? No, it looks like April has signed off. Okay, so sorry. We'll skip. Was that Sean? Did you want to answer that question? Did you have something you wanted to say about that?
I mean, I would just simply say that obviously this is a populist leaning president-elect, and he will listen to things that people care about. So he needs to understand that these are issues that people care about.
Right. Okay. Good. And David, question for you. You know, where is the middle these days? Is there a moderate and center caucus within both parties at this point, or are things so polarized to suggest that, you know, we might not see much progress in either direction over the next few years in Congress?
Yeah, I mean, the caucuses, those who are elected to Congress are as polarized as they've ever been, partly because of the way, you know, primaries work, and both caucuses have become much more ideologically pure, and that didn't really change. I mean, the changes in Congress were around the margins. This election, what's interesting about Trump, though, is that he scrambled the electoral map a bit, and he scrambled the coalitions of the parties a bit, so that there is now, within the Republican Party base of voters, a lot more visible support for things like actually, you know, maintaining and expanding, you know, entitlements and social safety net. You know, the people don't want the Republican coalition, the people who voted for Trump, you know, we're not interested in, you know, cutting or privatizing Social Security or privatizing Medicare, even though that's what Republicans in Congress have been trying to do for a long time. You know, Trump talked a lot about infrastructure investment. That came up earlier on this discussion, and that involves a lot of, you know, government spending and a lot of investment in potentially, you know, job-creating infrastructure that, again, the Republicans in Congress have been dead set against, you know, against stimulus, against infrastructure for quite a while. So some interesting tensions within that party, and frankly some parallel tensions on the Democratic side, but I think that the actual legislators haven't changed that much, and by and large you still have pretty ideologically polarized parties, and it's going to be quite difficult for them to work together even going forward.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and Sally Malanga makes an observation that, you know, the statistics presented show sort of a confused environment. You know, voters want to repudiate climate change, but increase the minimum wage. And so there's, you know, there are really some interesting inconsistencies here. And, you know, our analysis at ASBC is that this was an election largely for change, for disruption, that could create some positive opportunities, we hope. And again, you know, I think making a strong business case for change is vital. One of the things that we're seriously looking at is helping to challenge the incoming Trump administration's definition of success. So I think it's important for all of you to be asking the same question, you know, what does success look like, and whether the policies and appointments, you know, promoted by the new administration move the economy and our society in a healthy direction. Folks, being respectful of everybody's time, we want to wrap it up here. It's a little bit after the hour. Just a few closing remarks. First of all, thanks to all of our speakers. We really appreciate you all pulling this information together, presenting it to everybody today. Secondly, on December 8th, ASBC will be holding another webinar sort of building on this theme, but at that time looking at some of the developments of appointments by President-elect Trump's administration, looking at some committee assignments in Congress. We'll know much better also about cabinet appointments. And along with that, we'll be starting to hold a series of strategy calls around particular issues. Really encourage all of you that are members of ASBC to be in touch with us, indicate what issues you want to work on, how you want to work on it with us. Bob Keener, our media director, is standing by, happy to work with you on developing op-eds and letters to the editor. And, you know, it's really an important time right now to get the word out and help shape the conversation that's going on across the country. And finally, for those of you who are not members of ASBC, we really encourage you to consider joining. You can find information on our website about becoming a member. Membership, it essentially engages you in a very active process, and you can pick and choose the issues that you want to work on. So again, thanks so much for joining us. We'll send you a follow-up email that will list where the slides can be found online. And don't hesitate to contact Marvin McPherson or myself. Thank you all. Onward, we have lots of important work to do, so stay resilient, stay buoyant, and we will be in touch with you all soon, hopefully. Take care.